Well, thank you for having me on this special day. I'm currently researching on corruption and gender in kind of the broad field, different areas within that. I'm doing a lot of work on sexual corruption, so the idea that people pay with sexual acts that can be anything from naked photos to actual sex for a corrupt act, but also a lot of gender mainstreaming. Most recently, I'm looking at gender transformative approaches in anti-corruption. So that's what I'm working on now. Thinking back a little bit, I'm originally an economist by training. I also did a lot of international relations. And I started really looking only at corruption. So I wasn't kind of into gender as a research field at the beginning. And the journey looking at gender and corruption at the interlinkages really started when I went to Georgia about 10 years ago for my PhD fieldwork. And there were big protests that erupted after a very prominent professor had been killed by her husband very publicly. And there were a lot of protests for women's rights and against gender-based violence. And so I was trying to do interviews focusing on corruption, and people, without kind of noticing it, brought up a lot of these interactions between gender and corruption. And then I started to get interested and started to work on this topic and realized that there was an emerging research field, but many questions yet to be answered. So that's how I kind of started working more on gender. And then, of course, once I was in that field, I noticed how many areas still need to be covered. So that's when I became quite passionate about also the gender research field. What we see is that there are lots of women who do fantastic work, right? Who do great research, lots of non-binary people, lots of researchers in general who do really interesting work. But what we also see is that you still see a lot of barriers for women or gender kind of non-conforming individuals trying to reach higher positions in research. One kind of example that got me a bit radicalized about the topic was when I was in my undergrad. We had a female professor who got tenure, and then she had 2 babies right after each other because, for women it's very difficult to do that before tenure. And the male professors were losing their mind because how dare she do that, because they didn't have problem having children before, right? So there was a complete lack of understanding that for women that reaching tenure is quite different when you're kind of interrupted by breaks that you have to take as a woman for having a child. So I think that was one of the first kind of examples where there's, even though we might see more young women in university studying, the higher we go, the less women we see and the more male dominated it is. And so I think that we still see also in research institutes across the globe. I think there are lots of interesting initiatives who are trying to focus on having more diversity. So it's not just about having more women, but having also, a diverse women from different backgrounds. If I look at myself, of course, I was quite privileged, right? I'm German, I have a passport that allows a lot of travel. I'm white, so I have a lot of privilege, and I could still see kind of those barriers. Of course, for women who are marginalized in other areas, it's much more difficult. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. We see that a lot of professors are also, seeing that and are trying to push for more diversity in staff. But I think we still have a long way to go in making sure that we have that diversity. And of course, we need to think about that also impacts our research, right? It impacts what we research and what gets funded, because funding is often decided by, panels of senior professors. And if they're not interested in that kind of research, it doesn't get funded. So all of these things are impacted. So that's why diversity in the research field is so important. Well, maybe take a step back and look at what we know from gender and corruption research, is that we know that one of the reasons why having more women helps to fight corruption is because they break up networks, right? because for something like corruption, you need a very tight network to function. And if you have kind of outsiders come in, so especially individuals who are not part of the same elites already, they can help to break up these networks and make sure that we don't have as much corruption. And I would say that is true in lots of. So it's not only true about corruption, but it's also when we think about new ideas, kind of having change is often you need someone who's breaking up existing structures and who's bringing in new ideas and new viewpoints. And there again, having diversity, so having women, having non-binary individuals, having people from different backgrounds, social classes, all of these things can help us to kind of have new ideas, be innovative, and looking at the world as it is now. That's what we need, right? We need people who think critically, who think further in the future, who have innovative ideas. So I think sending that message, and all of these organizations are doing a lot on this, but continuing to send this message. The other thing is, of course, to make sure that this is not a women's issue or kind of a minority issue. This is a human issue, right? Men also get harmed by these existing structures, right? So patriarchal structures, for example, we know that they harm men as well, right? Because it's about powerful men bullying not just women, but also bullying other men. It's about who decides who is a proper man or who isn't, and what we consider manly behavior. All of these things harm men as well. So it's about making sure that they're also involved in this move towards kind of gender equality and a more equal and just society. So that's another kind of messaging to involve men and boys early on in the process. And again, many of these organizations are already doing it, but we need to continue doing it. And of course, at the moment, we see kind of this backsliding on gender across democracies worldwide. So it's really important that we continue sending this message. And kind of another point maybe is the question of gender mainstreaming and teaching gender mainstreaming, right? That gender mainstreaming is not just about checking one list, is there a woman involved in a meeting, but it's really about making sure that throughout the process of a project, for example, we think, how does this impact different members of society? And again, it's also about how are men involved, how are women involved, how are marginalized women or men involved. All of these things are important. And then, of course, ideally, we would move away from kind of purely gender mainstreaming towards a more gender transformative approach. So thinking about how does whatever we're looking at, so in my case, we're looking at anti-corruption initiative, how can we create anti-corruption initiatives that also promote gender equality at the same time? And this can also be, if we look at innovation policies, how do we make sure that these innovation policies also lead to positive gender transformative results? And I think one of the big things is and of course we're an education institute as well, is education, right? And we know that socialization on gender is often already, by the time kids start elementary school, they also already have roles in their mind of who they should be, who they can be, and how they're supposed to behave, and educating on gender and the importance of kind of everyone can do anything. Science is not for boys, and arts and crafts are not for girls, but everyone can do all these things. Is important that we do this throughout our educational institutes, from elementary school all the way to UNU and at university. I think two things. A, to understand how many women and non-binary individuals are there that are breaking barriers, right, every day, and that have done this for decades in the sciences and are doing really important research. But I think especially when we think about research, it's about taking this gender perspective, right? So not just ticking a box, there's a man and a woman, moving away from this binary understanding of gender, that it is men and women, but also understanding that including a gender perspective in our research makes our research better, it makes our results better, it makes our policy results especially more applicable, because we're not missing anything. So I'm really, that's my big message, right? That we shouldn't take this idea that, we have to include a gender angle because the donor wants it, as a kind of a burden, but as an opportunity to really make our research better and more applicable for the whole population.